Welcome to Eggshell Transformations, a podcast for intense people. My name is Imi, and I'm here with you on a journey. Hi everyone, today we have Galit Atlas. Galit is an experienced psychoanalyst who has a special interest in the way we inherit our parents, grandparents, and even our ancestors' pain. In this highly enlightening conversation, we talked about what emotional inheritance and transgenerational trauma are, how we can inherit trauma from our parents without knowing, the role of defense mechanisms in our lives, such as dissociation and splitting, and why trauma could bring shame even when on the surface it doesn't make sense. Well, I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I do. Now to Galit. Hi, Galit. Welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here today.
Absolutely. So I came across your work a while ago and I listened to and read some of your work, and I just thought this is such an important topic. And yet, although even clinicians don't really know about the depth of it, and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about, emotional inheritance is what you call it. And, basically trauma that get passed down through generations. And clinically, sometimes we call that transgenerational trauma. I'm sure we're going to go into all the jargons a bit later. But before we start, I would really love to hear a bit more about you. So your name is pronounced Galit. I mean, pardon my ignorance. Like, where are you from? And what's your story?
So I was born to a Syrian mother and an Iranian father.
Wow.
Who immigrated to Israel when they were 6 and 7 years old. And that's where I was born. And then I immigrated, speaking of emotional inheritance, to the US about 22 years ago. And since then, that's where I live. I live in New York City, and I'm a psychoanalyst and a faculty member at the postdoctoral program for psychotherapy and psychoanalysis at NYU.
Awesome. Brilliant. I'm really glad that you are a psychoanalyst. And honestly, out of all kinds of schools of knowledge, I think personally I get the most out of either psychoanalysis or depth psychology from Carl Jung. And so that really informed my way of thinking. We have a lot to talk about. And certainly your knowledge and expertise in psychoanalysis has really informed your work, and it really shows. So just to get our audience on the same page, what is emotional inheritance?
So emotional inheritance is the idea that emotions can pass down from generation to generation. And that our struggles, our emotional struggles, many times is related to our ancestors' experiences.
Ancestors, so not even our direct parents.
Yes.
Ancestors.
Not only our parents, but also our great parents, and sometimes grandparents, and sometimes great grandparents. We're talking here, and probably you and I will talk about that more, but I'm a clinician and I work with people. And part of what I found in my work is that when you sit with a client, with a patient, you actually sit not only with them, but you also sit with at least 2 more generations back that live inside them.
Or in the room.
Yeah, that are in the room without their parents, and who their parents are and what happened to them, and who their grandparents were and what happened to them is really, really important. And into that, I'm sure we will talk about new research on epigenetics that tries to understand how many generations back we can look, and how the previous generations' experiences, and especially trauma, but not only trauma, impacts our emotional life.
I guess that's something that a lot of clinicians don't really think about, because most people poke up one generation, at most 2, but I think very few people would go further. The idea of I mean, is this different to what I understood as what I call what we call transgenerational trauma? Because that is such a kind of jargony term. I think emotional
Right.
inheritance is so much more explicit and easily understood.
And it also contains in it more than just transgenerational trauma. And let me explain to your listeners, right? The idea of intergenerational transmission of trauma is something that psychoanalysts started looking at in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Those psychoanalysts were Jews who escaped Europe, many of them, and many of their patients were Jews who survived the Holocaust. And those people started feeling that the next generation, so that was already in the 60s, in the late 60s, right, when the first research started being published, they started thinking, we carry something about the trauma that didn't happen to us impacts our lives. And that was the first, writing on that topic. The first conference, I think, was in 1968 or 9, that started thinking about that. So this is not a new idea, right? And part of what they found is that there is, Maria Tork and Abraham, who wrote the book on the phantoms of history, were really talking and saying, that's one quote that I like from their work, and they're saying what haunts us are not the dead, right? And of course they're referring to the Holocaust here, but the secrets that are left in our minds, right? The secrets, the unspoken secrets, it's what haunts us, and not only the dead people. And I think that was the main idea. The main idea was really that there is something very devastating that happened that lives in the mind of the parents or the grandparents, and that the children can actually understand and not understand, but experience, feel. And of course, then the question is, how does that happen? And we could talk about the many ways that many paths to how that happened. But just to go back to your question about the emotional inheritance, the way I frame it is really, as you said, it's not just about the trauma. It's about all the kinds of secrets and unspoken experiences and emotions that are not necessarily symbolized or communicated directly, but that the next generation could experience, could feel, and that lives inside them.
When you say it lives inside them, that's really vivid. Basically, it affects their thinking, their feeling, how they feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or not.
Yeah, it is who they are, right? If we believe that experiences shape who we are, that means that our parents' experiences shape who our parents are, but then inevitably who we are.
It sounds really mysterious.
It's interesting because you're right. It sounds really mysterious because, and it's the right way to say it, even though, it's clearly not just mysterious. It is, but it feels mysterious because it's very enigmatic. It's something that is often nonverbal. It is often something that we can, it's hard to research. It's hard to put the finger on how that happens. So it feels mysterious. But in fact, I think that the research shows, and especially both actually the research on epigenetics and the research on attachment, that that our parents actually communicate with us in nonverbal ways, and that children feel what their parents experience, right? Feel what their parents.
What are some common examples? Like off the top of my head, can think of someone, it's a really mysterious thing. For instance, someone might be anorexic, like they can't take in food, and maybe because their grandparents or somewhere in the ancestor that there's poverty. It's something like that.
Absolutely.
Well, what have they
Absolutely.
found when it comes to the Holocaust survivor? What have they found?
I think that, again, we're talking about multiple levels of multiple paths of how that happens. So one of that, of course, is thinking, is it about the epigenetics and the expression of genes? And my research is really much more about attachment and about nonverbal communication and about relationships, connections between, which of course people always ask if it's something that's passed down through the body, and it's
and how much of it is
what
just
we
basically
call
the way our
nature.
parents interact with us, the way they talk to us, the way what we have observed.
I think that is always both.
Yeah.
And I think that all of us who research that really respect the other. I mean, I researched the behavior and attachment and nurture and the epigenetic, and I totally see and appreciate and understand that it's not only that there is something that is probably passed down in other ways that is in our body, because obviously our body holds the trauma, which is related to our our survival system, our stress hormones and things like that. And the people that investigate and research the epigenetics also understand that it is not just in the body, it is also in the communication, which is really interesting. There is one research, for example, that both are doing on 9/11 mothers who have been pregnant in 9/11 and lost their husband. And I think, interestingly, both the attachment research that is done by Dr. Beatrice Beebe in Columbia University and the epigenetics research that is done by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, that is a very important researcher of epigenetics. Both of them find the same things. So what we see really is that we are, the way I frame it in Emotional Inheritance is my book, is that we are attached to the people who raise us.
Can you give me some examples of things that
and we start our lives not being
secrets
differentiated from them,
but it's not
which means that we feel them.
Spoken.
We know them from inside, right? And no, the book has 12 chapters, and each chapter gives you a different example. So I'll go to one of them, which I think is
give us a taste.
A taste, for example, one of the chapters talks about sexual abuse and how a grandmother, it is the section on grandmother and on grandparents, and how the grandmother sexual abuse impacts her granddaughters' experiences of the world, but also how she inherits the feeling of being sexually abused. And I go into the details there of how does that happen, really. And then another example where we talk about not just intergenerational trauma, but things that happened to us before we were born, things that we don't know and just feel and experience through our parents' experiences. And so I talk in the book about loss of siblings, for example, and the experience that has many times happened before we were born or in the beginning of our lives. And there's one chapter, for example, about Noah, this guy that comes to therapy and he's feeling like he's obsessed with dead people. That's what he said.
Obsessed with dead people.
Yeah, his mother
and he has
always
no
said
idea why.
He's no idea why, and his mother is telling him, like, stop with these crazy ideas you have. You have bizarre ideas about that you. And one of those ideas or that he thinks he used to have a twin brother and his twin brother died. And he has all of these things that he feels are fantasies. And of course, in therapy, we go and investigate those and try to understand something about his preoccupation with death and with dead siblings. To give you a little spoiler to your listeners, what we find after a while is that actually Noah did have a brother. And it was not a twin brother. It was an older brother who died before he was born. And part of what we try really to understand, and that specific chapter talks about, is how one knows things that they were never told about. You know, and in Noah's case is a good example for that, like knowing something. And what I call in the book the ghosts of the unsaid and the unspeakable. The form of those ghosts, of everything that was not said, and of the unspeakable, everything we're not allowed to talk about.
What about people who all their life, I mean, how do you start exploring that with your clients when they come to you and say, I'm depressed. All my life, I don't want to be alive. I don't feel like I deserve a place in the world. I'm just sad. I have no idea why. How would you start exploring that with them?
You know, that's a very good question, because in reality, you know, many people, or I would say even most people, don't come to therapy to explore their emotional inheritance, right? They come to therapy because something hurts them, right? Or something happened to them, or they're struggling with something. If it's separation, if it's a divorce, if it's a loss, if it's, you know, affairs, or and they have what we call symptoms, depression, as you said, or headaches that somebody thinks they should go to a therapist for that, or anxiety. So the truth is, and it's interesting because since my book was published, many people come to me for the first time ever to say, I want to examine my emotional inheritance. But that is a reaction, right, to reading the book. And I think the book does make people want to investigate it, but that's usually not the reason why people come to therapy. And when they come, we don't necessarily start with, you know, with thinking that that's the only path. But we do start with what's your first memory was, and who are you and where are you coming from? Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? What's your family story, right? And then who are you and why are you here, right? And that investigation of what part of it is about your own unconscious, what part of it is about the intergenerational unconscious, what part of it is trauma that happened to you, what part of it is trauma that happened to right? This is a very, very delicate and usually also long investigation.
And sometimes people don't really know.
Right. Right. And we cannot know for them, right? And I think that's the essence of that journey. It's a slow journey where we really unpack layers of existence, of our own trauma, of our family trauma, of the world's trauma, right? I'm thinking about these days, we're very aware of, it's not just Holocaust, right? It's racism, it's slavery, it's, you know, and now it's of even global warming. You know, there is COVID, there are also social traumas. And so there's so many layers of unpacking that we're doing. And maybe one important thing to say is that those are usually interacting with each other. They don't exist separately. You know what I mean? Our childhood trauma somehow is in communication with our parents' and grandparents' trauma. And the COVID, right, somehow is in communication with our previous traumas. It awakens them. It allows us to some degree to process them. And it also re-traumatizes us. So all of those, there are layers of traumas that are always unconsciously in some dialogue with each other.
Does it make a difference whether or not our parents are still alive?
In what way? What do you mean?
I mean, do we directly go and ask them?
Right.
What
That's
kind
a
of
good
ancestry?
question.
I mean, like, those history
Yeah.
projects we did when we were a kid.
Yeah, I see that. I see what you're saying because when I said ancestors, it's like it feels like, wow, how can I even know what happened to my ancestors? I know my parents. I don't know all of these people that I sometimes never met, right? And I think in that sense, on one hand, it is easier, and on the other hand, it's harder. And I'll tell you why. It is easier because sometimes we can actually go and ask, right? It is more tricky because the fact we're going to ask doesn't mean we're going to get the right answers. It doesn't mean we're going to get the truth because many families hold a lot of secrets and things that are unspeakable, as I said, and they don't want to. So I think that in that way, there is what we call these days a lot of gaslighting around secrets. So you can come and ask and get
Gaslighting around secrets. Can you say more?
I think that the Noah story is a very good example of that, right? Noah senses something and he comes to his mother and his mother says to him, "You're crazy. What are you talking about?" And then years later, we understand that actually Noah was the opposite of crazy, right? He was so connected to reality. If we define craziness around disconnection from reality, right? If that's the definition, he's actually very, very, very connected to reality. He actually knows the reality, right? And so the gaslighting is about saying, "No, what are you talking about? This doesn't exist." And that's part of what we are confronted with when we talk about family secrets. And so in that sense, I totally agree that going and asking and is a very profound thing because what we know is that we often collude with family secrets. We don't ask, right? We don't go to our parents and ask them what really happened here and here and here, where there are gaps in the narratives, right? So there is something about asking. And I have to tell you, one of the most moving things that happened to me related to this book is hearing from people that they have family book clubs.
Family book clubs.
Isn't that brilliant? Family book clubs. They're reading the book together as a family and talking about it, which brings a lot of, we know the idea of book clubs, but family group book club was very new to me, right? And I think those special families that really say, let's talk about our family. It belongs to all of us. We are a system, right? We are all carrying something, and each of us carries something slightly different for the rest of us.
Why do children carry their family history and secrets for them? Is it their way of loving?
It's their way of loving. It's their way of being loyal. But mostly I think it's their way of not dysregulating their parents, not exposing them to something.
Not dysregulating their parents.
Yeah. Yeah, not dysregulating the parents, not exposing their parents to something that, right, the child from a young age knows where not to step, right, where not to go. And they know that through their parents' body language and through their parents, some layers of communications where through the gaps where the parents do not answer questions, and they know, okay, that is a question that should not be answered, right? And that's how we start colluding as a system, right? And in the book, I'm telling my own story about my mother's brother who drowned in the ocean when she was 10 years old and he was 14. And in our family, that was not a secret. And yet it was something that we didn't have permission to talk about because all of us were afraid of my mother.
I was about to ask you that because your book was very aptly titled A Therapist for Patients and the Legacy of Trauma. So the therapist is in there, and I'm assuming that's you.
Yeah, me as a therapist, as a human, right? And my own family is there, and my relationships with my patients, and the way I use myself and my own psychology in understanding my patients, in connecting to them, in understanding their defenses, in colluding with them and dissociating against trauma.
Colluding with them and dissociating with them. You
Uh-huh.
need to say more so our audience can relate to it. How do we collude with this whole family? You know, I understand what you're saying, but I would
Yes.
like you to expand on that. Like, how do we unconsciously collude with something that is toxic to us?
Yeah. This is what we all do
I think
unconsciously,
so
right?
too. Yeah.
You
I
think
was supposed
so?
to ask you that. Are there families without this?
I don't think there are, actually. I think we all have secret contracts with each other. And I think what
Secret
we're
contracts. I love that.
right, we have secret contracts with each other. And I think that even therapists and patients have secret contracts. And that's what I mean by colluding and dissociating, right? Because, and so there are the chapter on my mother's brother is a good example for that. Because how do I collude with that patient who comes in
Mm,
and tells me that she lost her brother?
mm,
And in that moment, I'm totally unaware that this patient is my mother, right? My mother lost her brother almost in the same
mm,
age that my patient did. And
mm.
so unconsciously, it is almost as if my mother comes to therapy, right? And I'm her therapist. But at first, I'm not only that I don't know that, I don't even remember that my mother lost her brother in that. And for a long time, I treat that patient as if something horrible happened to her. And it's the first time I hear about something so painful. And only later, and that is what I call, right? That is what we call dissociation, right? I become dissociative. I collude with her
Become
around.
dissociative means you're no longer conscious that you're doing that. Because I
Yes.
think when you say
Yeah.
dissociation, sometimes people think of a clinical dissociation where they zone out. But I think what you mean is it got split off. It's a form of splitting.
Yes. It's a defense mechanism, right? It's a dissociation is when something happens to it and we don't fully feel it or know it. We are disconnecting from it. And so it's there. It's not like if you told me that my mother lost her brother, I'm not going to tell you that I don't remember it. Obviously, I do remember it and I know it. But somehow in that moment, dissociation is that when that memory becomes peripheral, so peripheral and so outside of my consciousness that it is almost outside of my system. I don't include it in my memories. Right. And so in that moment, there is, of course, the question, why do I do that? Who am I protecting here? It's the defense mechanism, right? Am I protecting myself? Am I protecting my patient? Am I protecting my mother, maybe? Right? And not knowing that I'm going back and because that's what I'm used to do. We never talk about it, so I never even remember it. Right. So all of those questions are questions that are related to connections between people. How do we,
Connections.
right?
I mean, where does it all start? Is it a stretch to say it starts when we were conceived? Or before that?
I think that's what we are all investigating. And definitely there are theories that say that it started in the womb. Some theories are actually saying, and some research is about the sperm and the alternations, in the sperm and, and of course the expression of genes. It's like, it's about how our genes are modified and the expression is changing. So we're the impact of the environment on the expression of genes, right? And so that is, of course, before we were born, if we right in that investigation. But the truth is that this is a relatively new research, and we're people are investigating many paths, and I believe that the answer is in many like every very complicated answer, that the answer is that it happens in many layers, and that it happens in some ways that are biological, and in many other ways that are um, uh, environmental. Environmental, I mean the psychological environment.
I'm just thinking about in general, what is the role? Because we are, you as therapists, you as analysts, you know the language of defense mechanism. And it always sounds horrible when say we have defense mechanism, when actually it's just a coping mechanism. Things like splitting, like we split off things into either good camp or bad camp. What is the role of defense mechanism? Like really, actually, you've mentioned before that we suppress our memories to protect our parents.
Right.
What other defenses are in place when it comes to emotional inheritance? What about splitting? Is it in the picture?
It's a very good, it's a very good thought about defense mechanism, because the truth is that I love the word defense mechanism.
Do you? I think people just feel always, when I say that, people always think I'm criticizing them.
Because I think people sometimes confuse it with
being
telling
defensive.
them that they're defensive.
Yeah.
Right? But defense mechanism is a brilliant thing if you think about it, because it meant to protect us, to defend us from something where we are protecting ourselves, and often we really, really need that protection. And as children especially. So very often when we talk about a defense mechanism, we talk about things that saved our lives as children, right? And if you ask me what we talked about, dissociation, we're talking about idealization. That what is idealization? Is like thinking that it's denying any ambivalence and any negative things, making something be very, very, very good. Why? Defense mechanism often there because it protects us from anxiety, or it protects us from breakdown. So very often those amazing defenses that helped us survive as children become a problem for us as grown-ups. Right? Everything that, like I was just talking to a patient who was we were talking about how frightened she was as a child, and how her defense mechanism was to be functional and right, and not then to be dissociated.
When you say functional, do you mean be useful to other people, or just being
useful? The defense itself was to be dissociative, right? To be disconnected in some ways and not remember her pain.
And so many people live their life half dissociated.
Oh yeah, that's a very, very common defense. And I think that what happened was that she became somebody very, very functional that has a lot of pain, but the pain is not accessible to her or to others. She's very alone with it and often doesn't even feel it. Right. And all of that makes her less alive, less connected to people. She started paying a price for those defenses. Right. And so now we have a dilemma. How can we help her? Right. With all to change that defense, because everything that really, really, really helped her as a child is actually blocking her now.
I was going to ask, so what's wrong with having a defense then?
You see, I think that originally it's not wrong. I mean, that's why defenses originally really saved our lives, right?
Yeah.
But then we realized that they also limit us, right? Because if I wear a very, very heavy armor, then nobody can get to me and nothing can get to me. And I become isolated and lonely, or I can't have relationships really. And nobody knows me because I'm I'm behind this armor. And so I think that people start realizing that some of those defenses don't work so well anymore. And we need to not necessarily undo them, but maybe replace them and maybe look at them.
It's an expired strategy, as I call it.
Exactly.
What's the most common defense that you see in your clients or patients?
I think dissociation is definitely one of the most common one, but also omnipotence.
And in the book, okay, you need to expand on that, because I know it's a state that we used to be in when we were a child, and it's almost healthy because we want to feel like we can control our mom. Mom, give me milk. Mom, go away. It's all in our control. So how is that a defense now?
That's exactly right. That as children, omnipotence is a developmental stage, right?
Yeah.
Because if we feel out of control, then it means the world is not safe. If we cannot control our mom to give us milk, then, right, with the illusion that we control her, of course, omnipotence is an illusion. If we can control the mom, then we might die. right? What if she doesn't come to give us, right? So we need that illusion of being of omnipotence, the illusion that we can control others. And as grown-ups, we use it in the same way. We use it when we feel the world is not safe, when we need to have the illusion that we control things and we could do anything, right? Because otherwise we're too frightened. Otherwise we're too, right? And for example, you know what is a very, very common form of omnipotence? Guilt.
Yes,
Something,
yes.
you know what I
See,
mean?
I really get what you're saying, and I'm so glad you're saying it. And I don't know, I want you to expand on it, but I also feel the urge to kind of
You
share what
understand
I
it, and
see.
let me explain to your listeners.
Because you feel like it's your fault. You are so powerful that everything is your fault.
Yes.
If someone in the far away children dying in Africa is because you are so powerful that you're supposed to be able to save them and you can't.
Right. And think about it's exactly that, right? And think about kids, right? And of course, we do it as grown-ups all the time. Children, then their parents get divorced, for example. That's something everybody can relate to, right? Because we all know that children can blame themselves, right? And obviously, it's not the child's fault, right? As grown-ups, we also know that. But as a child, we could understand why that is a useful defense.
I'm supposed to be able to save my mother. I'm supposed to be able to make my mom happy. She's not happy. Therefore, it must be my fault.
Right. And why is it my fault? Because if it's not my fault, I can't fix it. I can't do anything about it. It means that the world could be chaotic and bad, and and I can be, and I'm just hopeless and helpless in that world. I cannot do anything. It makes me feel helpless. So what is the defense against helplessness? Omnipotence. It's all my fault. That's a form of omnipotence. And we can, of course, give many, many other examples of how omnipotence appears in our lives as grown-ups. And in the book, I go through that, right? And I talk about that.
What are some forms? I think when you say that, most people think of narcissism instead of guilt. They look so different, like someone who thinks everyone is their fault and they therefore don't take up space. It's very different from someone who, what we call narcissistic. Right.
Yeah, it's not narcissism. I think that thinking that it's not necessary. It could be narcissism, right? But it's not necessarily narcissism. Sometimes it is just a defense mechanism, a real defense against helplessness. And the more helpless you are, the more omnipotence you would make yourself.
I just think it's really hard for people to get their head around low self-esteem and omnipotence, because of what the word literally means in English language. I get you, but that's the glory and the perils of psychoanalysis. Like, people don't, it's hard to draw these things.
Yeah, it's hard, and yet I feel like people really get it, when if they don't know it, it sounds like big words, right? But the minute they read, when people read the book and they're like, oh my God, I realized that this is what I do, right? And the minute you explain it in simple words, the aha moment comes very quickly. Very quickly, you think like, oh, so this is what I'm doing, or this is what my mother was doing, or this is what my children are doing, and you immediately recognize and understand. You see, that's the difference between thinking that somebody tells you that you're defensive and between really understanding why you do what you do, why we do what we do, which comes from an empathic place, because we are all afraid of helplessness, right? And we all try to find and maneuver ways, against it, find ways to feel less helpless.
I love the way our conversation has gone. It's gone from emotional inheritance to much more rich concepts in psychoanalysis. Let's talk about, I'm mindful of time and we'll probably speak for another 10 minutes if that's okay with you. Okay, so let's talk about emotional inheritance and shame. Will shame just get passed down, or is there like a complex pathway?
That's a good question. Shame passed down it's not only passed down. We also are capable of creating it ourselves, right? But we definitely sense our parents' shame and hold it as our own. And shame is also very much related to trauma.
I know. I want to ask you
Right?
about that. So, see, I think, again, it's one of those things that is not explicit in the beginning. Surely we haven't done anything wrong. We were traumatized. We were the victim of the trauma. Why would we have shame?
It's a perfect timing for this question because it ties so beautifully to the previous discussion about helplessness. When we feel helpless, it evokes enormous amount of shame. And I think many times being a victim is a shameful position for people because of the profound helplessness. We're talking here about being a victim. It means that really something horrible happened to you and you could not defend yourself, and you are so helpless and I think that it breaks you down, right? It shatters you. And it brings up a lot of shame about, so to speak, not being strong enough, not being able to protect yourself, and all of those feelings that are very much related to, to links between trauma and shame. And that, of course, the next generation experiences their parents as filled with shame and often inherit that. So what we see and I think that goes back to your first question about intergenerational trauma versus emotional inheritance. The framework of emotional inheritance is really that we inherit the emotion that is passed down. And that is related to our conversation, which I love, that is not just about trauma, it's about emotions. Right? About defense mechanisms, about the human mind.
I'm sure you get this a lot. So how do I get rid of shame?
I find that it's the hardest thing, actually, because the truth is that even in therapy, when we talk about shame, we feel ashamed. It's one of those feelings that become that are reenacted. And if you come to your patient and you say, I feel that you're ashamed, you're going to shame them. And so it's a very, very difficult thing to talk about. And I think sometimes sharing shame is one way, and understanding that we are, and framing shame as a human condition, and sometimes even self-disclosure of therapists, which is very controversial in psychoanalysis, is a way to really. I think when it comes to shame, it's very. I don't want to use the word useful because I don't want to make it a technique, like, a tricky thing. We try to force our patients to talk about shame and make believe that it's really sharing a human condition. And I think that's what I was also doing in the book. I'm not presenting myself as a, as a healthy, knowing all therapist. I'm a human being. I have my own pains. I have my own shame. I have my own struggles. I have my own defense mechanisms. And I think that's a way to start talking about shame.
How do you start talking about shame? You can't possibly ask your clients, do you feel shame?
And I think it really depends on some people already did some work and they come to you with very, very clear awareness of shame. And I think the beginning of talking about anything is awareness, right? Is not resolving things. It's not giving answers. It's right. It's just.
And yeah, and I'm sorry to deviate away a little bit from what we're talking about, but on this topic, I really want to ask you something. Do you find a lot of clients are very, very anxious about your blank screen?
About the blank screen?
or any blank screen. Yeah, when you sit there and you don't say anything. Because I have a lot of clients who feel extremely uncomfortable with any seconds of silence.
This is a question that I could talk about for the whole hour, because because
okay, sorry about that.
Exactly. I give you the digest answer, as they say, because in the history of psychoanalysis, the blank screen was a useful way of working, because the understanding was that whatever the patient feels, they will project on you or talk to you, right? And that the therapist's feelings and who they are as people can confuse the patient or burden them with something. And that sometimes is still the case. The difference in our theory is that we switch from a one-person psychology to a two-people psychology. And the relational psychoanalysis, which is the school of analysis that I'm teaching and practicing, really embraces that. What does that mean in simple words for your listeners? It means that the therapist comes as a human, with the understanding that my psychology I still think that telling the patients everything is a burden on them, and that we're not talking about hierarchy anymore, as we said before, but we're talking about asymmetry. It's not a symmetrical relationship. It's a relationship when I'm here to understand you, and therefore I have a different role and I have a different responsibility. But we switched to a model where there is mutuality, which means that I come to you and talk to you as a human being, and I can love you, and I can have other feelings about you, and I can, right? And I use my psychology as well. And we assume, and therefore many of us do not work with, we don't even believe in in blank screens. Still, we try not to burden our patients and make this relationship too symmetrical, because people have people in their lives. They don't come to us in order to have symmetrical relationships, right?
No, of course, we won't want to be stuck talking about ourselves and our trauma. Right. Some degree of co-humanity might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I love that, the co-humanity, right? And we talk about mutual
just came up with that word. It's not a technical word. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, okay. So if someone is curious about the idea of the secrets they carry, things that they have always felt but are not able to verbalize, where would you point them to start? Is there like a short, maybe even a meditation or like a short reflection that you can guide them towards?
I think that where we start is always with self-reflection and trying to ask questions, ask ourselves, what is it that we are looking for? What is it that I am feeling? And I always feel that it's a very, do you hear me? Because you were frozen.
I don't know why I'm
everything
frozen.
Is fine. Okay.
Everything is fine.
That's confused me. So maybe edit that a little bit. I'll answer it again. Okay. Because I feel that what we're doing is really the whole process of therapy for me is about self-reflection. It's about self-reflection. And that's where we start. It's about creating, not giving answers, but framing questions. And for me, that is one of the places where we start.
Self-reflection. That's vague. Would there be one or two questions they can start asking themselves? If I were to
it's far from the way I work, because for me, the work is never self-help work. It's always a work of, it's always relational. It's always a way of really and I think it's interesting, right? Because to me, relational work, even my book is a relational work, right? When there is something about, when people ask me, what was your goal about writing this book? My goal was not to teach you anything. It wasn't to give you what people sometimes say about self-help, but give you tools. That is not my goal. My goal is to bring you with me into an emotional journey that helps you think about your life, that helps you reflect, have self-reflection, read something and say, maybe I'm doing that too. Oh, I understand something about myself. To me, that is the emotional journey that I am inviting.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are so many more questions I want to ask, but maybe I have to get you come again.
You know, I loved our conversation. It was very, very meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually,
Yes.
one last question. What would breaking the cycle of trauma bring us?
What breaking the cycle of trauma bring us? I think that the one answer to that is new possibilities.
That sums up everything. New possibilities, I guess, for ourselves, for our next generation.
Yeah, for ourselves and for the next generation, exactly. New possibilities, new ways of being in this life, and not just the automatic ways that we inherited or learned.
Yeah, automatic way is such a good word. We just usually we react rather than respond automatically.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So what's next for you? Do you still have energy for this subject, or have you moved on to some new inquiry?
You know, at this point, I am publishing this book in 19 countries. And so I am just started. It's just started being publishing in many places, and I go sometimes travel, but most of the time I do Zoom and online virtual stuff in different languages. Very, very interesting to see and learn how different cultures respond to the same material. And you won't be surprised, I'm sure, that every culture takes it slightly different, processes it slightly different, and that there is also a cultural perspective on that topic. So that's where I am right now, really understanding something about the cultural piece in each of my publications in different countries, and teaching. You know, I teach that course to clinicians.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for doing what you're doing. The world benefits
so
from
much. Thank
you.
you.
All right, then. I think I probably let you go. Would you be open to me having another conversation with you if I have more energy and libido?
Of course.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very, very much.
Galit,
Thank
right?
you so, yes. Thank you so much.
No problem.
It was
okay, have a good day. No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in. For more, please head to eggshelltherapy.com. There you will find more stories, articles, and resources for people just like me and you. Bye now.
Keep putting one foot in front of the other, moving forwards, never looking back. Just one more foot in front of all those countless others, and we're there. Imagine that.